pillory, sometimes called the stretch neck, was less a machine for causing pain and more a machine for causing shame. It was a hinged wooden frame on a raised platform in the market square, with 3 holes cut through it, one for the head and one for each wrist. The boards closed at shoulder height, forcing a person to stand hunched forward, arms splayed, for hours. I've put this one first because on its own it barely hurts. The real damage came from the crowd. Spectators threw whatever was at hand, and a mob that decided you deserved worse could turn a shaming into a killing. England only struck it from the books in 1837, 50 years after the American Revolution. Humiliation was the point, and the next device made that point in iron. The scold's bridle, better known as the branks, appeared in Scotland and northern England around the 16th century. It was an iron cage of flat bars locked around the head, handed out almost exclusively to women accused of gossiping or arguing in public. The cruel part sat inside. A flat metal plate, sometimes studded, pressed down on the tongue so that speaking or swallowing became painful. Some surviving examples weigh several pounds, roughly a full bottle of water strapped to the skull. The wearer was then led through the streets on a chain, or chained to a post for hours. In some towns it escalated, and she was ducked in the river still wearing it. Restraint and public display worked so well together that carpenters built a wooden version for 2. The shrew's fiddle, also known as the neck violin, was a hinged wooden board shaped a bit like a violin. It clamped shut around the neck and both wrists, leaving the hands locked out in front of the face. Useless. Surviving examples weigh 10 to 15 pounds, roughly a bowling ball hanging off the collarbone, and it could be worn for days. Eating required someone else's help. Sleeping was close to impossible, since the board wouldn't let the head rest anywhere. There was a double version built for 2, which locked feuding neighbors face to face until they settled the argument. Discomfort was the entire design, but a far smaller device could do far more damage. The thumbscrew, called the pillowinks in Scotland, was small enough to carry in a coat pocket. 2 flat iron bars sat above and below the thumbs, joined by a screw the interrogator turned by hand, a fraction of a turn at a time. That slow control was the point. Pressure built until the nail bed split and the bones underneath began to give way, and the interrogator could stop, ask again, and resume. Because it was portable and left a person conscious and able to speak, it became one of Europe's most common interrogation tools from the 15th century onward. Larger versions existed for the toes and knees. Crushing worked on small bones, but the next device crushed nothing at all. It simply refused to let a person sleep. The heretic's fork was a short metal bar with 2 prongs at each end, hung from a leather collar. One pair rested under the chin, the other against the breastbone, holding the head tilted permanently back. Around 8 inches, roughly the length of a pen, was all it took. A person could still whisper but couldn't lower the chin without the prongs pressing in, so sleep was out of the question. Some surviving pieces are engraved with a single Latin word meaning "I recant." We're not entirely sure how widely these were used, since most surviving pieces come from later collections. Denying sleep worked slowly, and so did the next method, which needed nothing but water. Chinese water torture has almost nothing to do with China. It was described by an Italian lawyer, Hippolytus de Marsilius, in the 15th century, and the name was attached later as showmanship. A person was strapped down so the head couldn't move, and cold water fell onto the forehead 1 drop at a time every few seconds for hours. Physically, it does nothing. There's no wound, no mark, nothing to show a cord afterwards. What breaks is the anticipation. The mind can't adjust to something irregular it can't predict or escape, and long sessions reportedly left people disoriented for weeks. Water left no evidence. The next device left plenty, because it was built around the largest bones in the body. The Spanish boot, sometimes called the bootykins, was a pair of iron or wooden casings strapped around the legs from knee to ankle. Once fastened, the interrogator hammered wooden wedges into the gap between the casing and the leg. Each wedge, about this of a doorstop, drove the plates further inward. 4 to a dozen were typical, and the later ones did the real work, compressing the shin until the bone fractured. It was used heavily in Scottish witch trials, partly because the person stayed conscious and able to answer. In one variation, boiling water or molten lead was poured in instead. The boot at least was real. The most famous torture device in the world probably wasn't. The Iron Maiden, or the Nuremberg Maiden, is the one everybody pictures. An iron cabinet around 7 feet tall, taller than a doorframe, shaped roughly like a woman, with a hinged front door lined with spikes. The story says the door closed slowly so the spikes entered without striking anything immediately fatal, keeping a person alive inside for hours. Here's the crazy thing though. There is no reliable medieval record of any such device. It seems to have been assembled around the early 19th century, most likely from unrelated pieces and toured as a paid attraction. The original was destroyed in a bombing raid in 1944. In my opinion, it's the most successful piece of marketing in the history of torture. The next name is just as famous, and that one has the paperwork. The rack, known inside the Tower of London as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, was a rectangular oak frame with a roller at each end. A person lay flat, ankles tied to one roller and wrists to the other, and a lever turned them by ratchet, one notch at a time. The first turn simply pulled the limbs straight. Then the shoulders and hips began to separate at the joints, and with enough tension the ligaments and tendons tore. A body could be stretched several inches, and many who survived never walked properly again. Anne Askew was racked there in 1546 until she had to be carried to her execution. Pulling a body apart took machinery. The next device relied on nothing but the body's own weight. The Judas cradle, sometimes called the Judas chair, was a wooden pyramid roughly 3 feet tall, about the height of a kitchen counter, mounted on a frame. A person was hoisted above it by ropes and lowered onto the point, so their entire weight rested on a single spot. The interrogator held the rope and could raise or lower them by inches, stretching a session across hours or days. Because the frames were never cleaned between uses, infection killed more people than the injury did. Hedging is fair here since the evidence is thin and most illustrations come from far later collections. The next one, unfortunately, sits in court records across half of Europe. The breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, was often just a wagon wheel, around 5 feet across and roughly as tall as a person. The condemned was tied spread-eagled over it, or over a wooden cross on the ground. The executioner swung an iron-shod club at the gaps between the supports, shattering each long bone in several places. The limbs, now loose, were braided through the spokes, and the wheel was hoisted onto a pole and left standing in public. Death came from shock, blood loss, or exposure sometimes days later. A merciful executioner could be paid to strike the chest first. Parts of Europe kept using it until 1841. Ancient Sicily had a different idea entirely, and it was cast in bronze. The brazen bull was commissioned by Facilaris, the ruler of Acragas in Sicily, around the 6th century BC. It was a hollow bronze bull, life-sized, with a door in one side and a fire pit underneath. A person was locked in, the fire was lit, and the metal slowly heated until it cooked them. The detail that made it famous was acoustic. Pipes in the head converted the sounds from inside into something resembling the bellowing of a bull, turning an execution into entertainment. Its inventor, a man named Perillos, was reportedly the first person put inside as a demonstration. Most of this comes from later Greek writers, so some of it may be legend. Fire was quick compared to what Imperial China reserved for its worst crimes. Lingchi, usually translated as death by 1,000 cuts, was kept for treason, killing a parent, and a short list of other crimes considered unforgivable. The name oversells it. Most recorded cases involved between 8 and 120 cuts, not 1,000, and the executioner worked from a fixed sequence. The purpose was partly religious. In Chinese belief, a body that wasn't intact couldn't properly enter the afterlife, so the punishment carried on past death. Families sometimes paid the executioner to give opium beforehand, or to make the first cut the fatal one. China formally abolished it in 1905. That one at least used a blade. The next method barely used one, and could keep a person alive for days in full public view. Impalement is most associated with Vlad III of Wallachia, though it was used across the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and parts of Asia for centuries. The stake was deliberately blunted and greased rather than sharpened, because a sharp point caused rapid internal damage and a quick death. It was driven in slowly, then raised upright so gravity could do the rest. Surviving 2 or 3 days was not unusual. After one campaign, chroniclers described a forest of roughly 20,000 stakes outside Targoviste, the population of a small town, standing upright along the roads in every direction, though medieval numbers are usually inflated. In my opinion, it's the most calculated thing on this list. Except for one, and that one barely used a device at all. Scaphism, also called the boats, is considered by many to be the worst on this list, and it needed almost nothing to carry out. A person was placed between 2 boats fastened together, with only the head, hands, and feet left exposed. They were fed milk and honey until sickness set in, and more honey was smeared across the exposed skin. The boats were then pushed onto a stagnant pond in full sun. Insects did the rest, drawn by the honey and by waste that had nowhere to go. The Greek writer Plutarch records a soldier named Mithridates lasting 17 days. That account is our only real source, so it may well be exaggerated, and somehow that doesn't make it any easier to read.